there's one big mistake that so many runners make that keep them struggling with calf injuries and pain again and again and again. It becomes a recurring pattern. The problem, a lot of the time, has actually got nothing to do with the calves. Now, I could talk about training plans and training mistakes, things like adding too much speed work too soon or adding too much volume. We're not going to talk about that. Of course, it's true that if you make big jumps in your training, sometimes it's the calf that becomes the weakest link. I could also talk about lack of strength in the calf muscles, whether we're talking about gastroc or soleus. And you can go through a simple test, something like our test to get you doing 3 sets of 25 single leg calf raises on each side. If you can do 3 sets of 25 on each side, single leg, you're probably ticking the box in terms of strength for your calves. Of course, if there is weakness there, you're opening yourself up to injury when you're running. But that's not the point I want to talk about today. The point I want to talk about is how the calves really sit within the bigger picture of our running gait and the demand that running puts on our body, and how through other areas letting you down, you end up overloading your calf, and every time you get serious about your running, the calf becomes that point of failure. So what am I talking about? I'm talking specifically about the way as we're running and we get to the point where foot hits the ground, foot comes underneath you, you get to mid-stance here, the point where the foot's underneath the hip. From here, this leg, this standing legs roll is all about propulsion, pushing you off onto the next stride. And we want to get that propulsive power from some of the biggest muscles in the body. So glutes and hamstrings in particular, they're big, meaty, powerful muscles for a good reason. They're there to drive you on effectively onto the next stride. Now, the role of the calf, whether we're talking gastroc or soleus, but particularly gastroc in this instance, is to actually transfer the force from above down into the ground below. A lot of the time we see two joint muscles in the body. So gastroc, the big means one of those calf muscles crosses the knee and crosses the ankle. Those two joint muscles are all about transferring force from one segment to another, rather than creating the push itself. Now, if glute max, hamstrings aren't working hard enough, either through poor activation, inhibition, or simply weakness, to push you onto the next stride, the body is fantastic at compensating. Your body will know how to pick up the slack even to its own detriment. So you'll still be able to drive off onto the next stride, but these muscles, our calf muscles, will do what they do best around the ankle, push off into plantar flexion to drive us forwards, but in a far less effective, far less efficient way. Look at them. I mean, small, sinewy muscles in comparison to big, powerful, meaty muscles made for power. So if you're relying too much on these guys and not enough on these guys, they're soon going to get overworked, overloaded. So a lot of the time when we're looking at calf injuries, we can look, yes, at what's happening as the foot hits the ground. And if you are running around with a big pronounced forefoot strike, of course the calf's going to be working harder. But that's not the end of the story. Really, it's what happens towards the back end here when it comes to understanding how much power, how much demand is being required of these calves, and why, in many respects, they're doing too much. Now, there's some telltale signs. If you are landing and then from here, pushing from the hip, getting glutes, hamstrings involved to push you forwards, the position of the hip versus you moving forwards means you're going to get a nice horizontal drive, obviously with a little bit of vertical push as well. You're not simply going to be moving horizontally forwards like you're riding a bike. But if instead you're pushing more so from the ankle, there is more of that vertical component to the push. So you see runners who look quite bouncy in their stride, quite ankly in their stride. I'm going to really struggle to demo this, but as opposed to pushing off nicely through the hip, you end up in a position where you are almost kind of bouncing along through the ankles, if that makes sense. Now, Another telltale sign is that when you slow a video down of someone running and you look at what's happening in terms of the rear foot as it leaves the ground, what we don't want to see is that as the foot leaves the ground, we see this flick into a plantar flex position here. Ideally, we want to see, instead of the ankle flicking back like this, we want to see the foot stays relatively dorsiflexed as we come through swing phase. If we can dorsiflex the foot as we come through swing phase, and by that I mean keep the toes pulled up gently, you're actually going to get into a better triple flex position here. So hip flexed, knee flexed, ankle dorsiflexed, which actually starts to trigger a reflex called the cross extensor reflex, which means that as we're better at flexing on this side, we are better in terms of quality of extension drive on this side. We start using our glutes a little bit better on the opposite side. So without getting too deep into it, you can start affecting what's happening on the stance leg by getting better at what's happening with the swing leg. But it all starts with what happens as that foot leaves the ground. If we have a tendency to overwork through our calves, that foot will flick as opposed to just gently stay dorsiflexed. Now, yes, we've got to understand why those glutes and hamstrings aren't doing enough. Yes, there's lots of glute strengthening work, hamstring strengthening work that is super, super important to do. I'll link some videos at the end of this video, which will show you exactly what to do if you think those glutes aren't working while you're running. But as well as that, we can start improving the capacity for work and the strength within that whole calf and ankle complex. And there's a resource that I will leave a link to down in the description of this video, which will give you some simple exercises, simple workouts to work through to help building strength in your calves if you do have a history of calf problems. So definitely go and check that out. I hope this helps. Do check out that video linked over here, which will talk to you specifically about how to use your glutes when you're running, because a lot of the time, if you're not using your glutes well, your calves are going to pay the price.